that is your original draft. Comments on that draft that you received from the referee, and then, thank you, and then the final version. That's what I think I'm getting. What I'm looking for is what your referee said to you, so I can gauge what was said in the way of constructive criticism in round one and how you responded to it. Is that what I have? That's what everyone thinks? But you're, okay, do you still have that?
I actually can go up and print, it's in an email, so I can print it off.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Can you use the printers up in the library? Do they have printers up there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
They do, yeah.
They just cost money if you have that in yours. Yeah. That's
And
the
then
only
we'll get
thing.
like $2.
I'll give you a
Yeah.
allotted amount. Oh,
Yeah,
gee.
I think you have
Like four
some in your
cents.
account already though. I don't know. It's weird. It takes days to print something.
How's it going?
Ooh, Dr. Sackett.
Got a new job working at
So you're
housing
teaching
office at
for World War II global history?
Really?
No.
So nice.
I thought you were doing like a lecture on
I'm
the
giving a guest lecture in it.
Yeah, when is
Man.
that?
You're a real instructor.
I'm really looking forward to that.
That's a week from tomorrow.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah. Well,
I'm excited.
I look forward to it too. I also look forward to deciding what it is I'm going to say.
It's that class is really interesting.
I can only imagine. Yeah,
Ah.
that's bound to be fantastic. The three of them and these different world perspectives on the Second World War.
And now we're just now getting into the European war part.
Yes.
And we were watching this video about roughly 40 million people died during World War II. That just number just blew my mind. It's just wow.
Yeah, I've seen estimates up from that too.
Yeah. Oh, just
It is
wow.
it is mind-boggling. So, okay, yeah. At the break, you're certainly welcome to go and print the comment. Hi.
So she emailed me pictures, so I don't really know, like.
Pictures?
Yeah, so that's how she got me back the. She was like, so I don't
Okay,
know. If
and that was Cassidy? Where's Cassidy?
I
Ah.
asked her if she had it, but
Super cute.
I don't know. I'm gonna put those.
What?
A lot of color. I said I don't want to put those at home.
I've just started wearing hats.
Yeah.
Color, so I didn't know. Do you want me to try to
I
print
can't
those?
have my job,
I bet you that Cassidy,
so I just have like messy long hair each morning.
we could also ask Cassidy for a copy
Yeah,
of that.
she has it. Do you want me to give you this now, or just?
Oh, go ahead. I'll remember that. Now, problems with this. I think there are some. I know of one case. Well, now the referee isn't here, so there's no. But I know of one case where the person has been ill, and nothing has happened in the way of a rough draft so far. She will get it soon. In general, are there problems to register this morning? I mean, I spoke with you a moment ago about that. By now, of course, an original draft needs to have been sent to a referee. The referee needs to have gotten back to you. You need to have written a revision in part as a response to what the referee said, which I hope was constructive criticism, and then I get all of the above stapled together in one paper. That's what I expect. There are some problems, and I just spoke with you. I mean, obviously, if you've been prepared to be a referee and you've not been gotten in contact with, I can hardly criticize you for your failure to complete that part of the assignment. Well, I wish Edmund were here, because I think Edmund is the referee for a problem case that I know. Are there other problem cases? Is everyone? Yes.
I sent mine to my referee, but I'm not sure if my email's not working. I emailed her 3 times, and I haven't received anything back.
Well, let me see if I can infer from this who you're.
It's Fallon. Like, she said she didn't get it from me, or I got the email from you. And then
Yes. Yeah, you would have gotten an email from
then
me.
I sent it to her again 3
This
times.
here's Fallon.
I never got it. Like, I don't know what's going on.
Well, now Okay, this is a good example
I printed
of,
it out
of,
and
of
brought
the
it to
problem.
class.
This is a good example of the problem.
Because I don't do that editing online, so.
I mean, one way
Should've
to
had
approach
it.
this, the way I don't want to
Okay.
approach this, is to just say, oh, heck with the whole referee business, just hand me the paper. Um,
That was hard. I didn't
the,
really know what to say.
the
about
trouble
it
with what I'm
either.
going to suggest is I have no idea about Fallon's time, and I don't want to impose on Fallon's time. Is that, I mean, maybe maybe 2 weeks ago would have been a better week for you to be in this role than this week, for all I know about your schedule. Are you in the position to be able to take the paper from Rihanna now and do that? Not this week. Okay, well, that's the problem. Pardon? Pardon me?
I said, yeah, I could write.
Yeah, okay, so it's a lousy week, and that's, I knew that would happen if there were.
I read what you sent me, and I sent her an email back. I can show her the email I sent her.
Which
Oh.
one did you send it to? I never got it.
I just replied to you from your email that you sent me.
I never got it.
Okay.
That sucks.
Well, then, I mean, this sounds to me like a correctable problem. If, where do you have the email that you sent?
You can resend it right now.
All right, oh, resend it right now so we can have cyberspace work to our advantage. It usually works to my disadvantage. But,
Again, what you already sent.
okay,
Weird.
so are you R. Gray at UCC?
Yeah, I
Okay,
never got, I'm on Outlook right now and I never got it. That's why I'm like, huh.
okay. Well, then this should work. Now, Edmund, your situation is the person for whom you are the referee has been ill. And she's been, ill enough that she isn't very far enough along. That she isn't far enough along with this right now. I assume you have not yet gotten a rough draft from her. All right. If she, I don't want to impose on anyone's time, but if she gets that to you, could you give it the read? Okay, good, then that will work. And if there are any other problems of this nature, then please see me maybe after class and we can try to straighten these out. So, and maybe, okay, so maybe we can talk about then later. Let me in any case welcome everyone in class and also off campus to HIST3000 Section 2. And I'll go through names. I've got Edmund, Cameron I just saw. Brian is here. I see John Callahan off campus on the CUNet list. If you would get in touch with me, that would help. We've got Erica. We've got Dylan. We've got Dune. We've got, you get my message yesterday? About, okay, good. And we've got Andrea, and Danielle is here, and Rihanna is here, and Fallon, and let's see, Cassidy, I don't see. And let's see. Okay, Cassidy I don't see. Ryan is here, and Austin is here, and Joe is here. Jennifer I don't see offhand. Allison I just spoke with. Lindsay. Victor is up with the printer. Hope that works for him. Amy. Caitlin. Dennis. How about Robert? Robert I don't see. And Isabella Dow. And I know that she's not going to be here. Okay. Well, let's plunge into the issue for today. The issues for today. And then we can try to straighten out confusions around the referee role maybe at the end of class, okay? As you know, what you've done for today is to complete a reading of the book by Peter McPhee, whose title is Living the French Revolution. You also know that this book starts with a refusal to accept a very common assumption. And the common assumption has to do with the overwhelming centrality and importance of Paris in the French Revolution. The point here is to look to the experience of ordinary people during the French Revolution, and in particular the experience of the peasantry. Now it may occur to you to challenge any assumption that peasantry is but another word for ordinary people, and of course peasantry is not. But we have to bear in mind that we look back to France in the late 18th century, before the time of the large-scale extension of industry, to a time when in fact 85 to 90% of the population were rural folk, in other words peasantry. Hence what must seem, or what may seem to you to be a presumption, this equation of the idea of ordinary people with peasantry. And when we take stock of the fact that such a large proportion of the French in the in the 1790s were peasants who lived in villages and at the most small towns, then we become aware of the absolutely monumental task of research that this historian undertook. Now, to a degree, he rests upon the work of others, but to a degree, he did the legwork himself and drove, or in some cases, no doubt, trudged from village to village to village to find the kind of local municipal archives that informed the research that he did. You will have seen that in the face of this immense number of villages, 44,000 all told, you will have seen that it is hard to sustain any generalization, because to every generalization, an exception can be found. But he upholds the thesis that the revolution marked a change in the everyday life of the French, by which he means here the French peasantry. Everywhere, the peasant was beckoned into the assumption of a role that he or she had never played before. For example, in municipal politics, for example, in the village commune. And that was a role that, having once assumed, changed life. Well, forever is a long term for historians, but in any case, changed the future horizon of all of the people involved. And so the question becomes less, what did this or that peasant village, how did this or that peasant village respond to the National Assembly or the Legislative Assembly or the Girondins or the Mountain, that faction of the Jacobins? The question becomes, how, at a more fundamental level, was life altered? People whose lives had been marked by relative powerlessness now had a degree of power that they had never imagined having before. Moreover, the revolutionary legislation effected the elimination of a large range of feudal obligations. Obligations that varied from place to place, but that had to be met with regard to the local lord, the local seigneur, in other words. That marked a change. There was change in the control of land, the ownership of land, in part through the sale of church lands that had been confiscated by the revolutionary government, and whose sale was meant to stabilize a new revolutionary currency. And that was just the beginning of it. With regard to the king, who lost his throne and in 1793 lost his life to the guillotine as punishment for treason, so the revolutionary leaders in Paris saw it. With regard to him, there was little mourning, evidently, throughout the country of France. Little mourning for the entire old regime, if by the old regime we mean also the system of ownership of land that is wrapped up in the term seigneurialism, if we mean the privilege of the lord on the land. And these were things that had been eliminated, and they were things that went unmourned. The church is different. And if there is an institution of the old regime that drew some mourning, it was no doubt the church. By which I do not draw attention to the sale of church lands. I mean, after all, in many cases it was the peasantry, more or less, that was the beneficiary of the sale of church lands. By which I do not also draw attention to the to the elimination of the requirement of tithe. That also passed without regret, at least certainly from those who paid the tithe. Those who received the tithe, well, that's a different story. But I refer here, of course, to the central issue of the Constitution of the Clergy from 1790. Now, someone explain to me the issue. Why is it that we stop and linger over the church in a way that we did not have to stop and linger over seigniorialism or the monarchy? Why? Yes?
The church gave comfort to the peasants in their everyday life, and gave them
Okay.
for a change when they died, so it gave them hope, whereas the monarchy
All right.
affected everybody.
Okay.
Well, it did, but
It hit belief. And the church, that, you know, for a time we described really only as a kind of extensive landowner, the church was also the institution that provided comfort and provided tradition through the ministry of sacraments. And those suddenly were put in question. Yes?
May I real quick ask, what happened to Protestant churches during this time? Were they...
That's a good question.
Like, I get the strong sense that France was highly Catholic because they don't really mention them too much.
Yeah. Since 1685, in theory, there were no Protestants in France, although there were. But they were, I mean, in theory, they had been driven from the realm. But the Protestants had also, there was a new edict of toleration actually issued under Louis XVI 2 years before the Revolution, which made it possible for Protestants to come out of concealment. And in 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen affirmed the idea of toleration, and that idea was also affirmed in the Constitution of 1791. Of course, I mean, think back on, this is how I would start to answer the question. I'm not sure that I can name a book that handles this issue. It's a great issue. Of course, it deals with a religious minority. But how is it that the church managed to run afoul of these revolutionaries, who were, after all on board with the 1789 Declaration of the Right of Religious Freedom? What did the church do to draw the ire of first the National Assembly, then the Legislative Assembly, to say nothing of the convention?
I mean, I
Come on in, Richard. Sure, it's okay.
I think a lot of it, like he said earlier, was like, and you said, just when you attack belief, it really strikes up those who are believers of the church.
Okay.
So the church had a following that it's,
Okay.
you know, had for an extremely long time now, and
Okay.
and
But
once
why
you
did the
attack-
revolutionaries attack belief? If in the first hour they stood for freedom of religion, which should, after all, cover the Catholic Church as well as it covers anyone else on earth.
I mean, the Catholic Church was still a mark of the old regime. Like,
Okay.
the fact that it still existed when few things did exist from that time.
Okay.
I
Okay.
think it was just kind of like they wanted to rid themselves of it so they could build up their new institutions, which
Okay.
in this case would be the supreme being.
I mean, that certainly is there by 1793, 1794, and that is a nice description of the position that, at the end of his political career, Robespierre assumed. But think back on Tackett. The way for him, nothing was foreordained, nothing was predetermined in 1789. These were a group of revolutionaries with an attachment to various principles of the Enlightenment, who months before would not have anticipated that they would declare themselves a national assembly that would be the source of all law in France. Their initial move was not to attack the Catholic Church, but then they did within, let's say, a year and a half. How would the Catholic Church run afoul of them? That's my question. And Tackett, I think, is the one who leads us in the direction of asking questions like these. Not, well, you know, you have to look at the ideas. Well, you have to look at the, you know, at the contingent circumstances under which all of these actions took place. Yeah.
Well, I think the National Assembly was open to multiple religions. I think in 1790 they had a president who was Protestant.
Yes, they did.
So I think the Third Estate had a lot of Protestants among them.
Yes.
I don't know if there's proof behind it, but I think there is. I mean, and I think they had a lot of Protestants among them, so they just had a voice for freedom of religion because it went along with the other freedoms they were being given.
That's altogether true. Yes.
The church had a tendency to favor the nobility.
All right.
They were one of the chief supporters of the nobility.
Okay.
Any credence they had was lost.
Okay, now question. Which part of the church? Here we come again to this problem of generalization.
Hierarchy.
The hierarchy. I mean, after all, the highest noble families thought of the bishoprics and archbishoprics as, in effect, a noble privilege. And those positions were held in their overwhelming majority by members of noble families. And so, from the beginning, the hierarchy of the Catholic Church began to looked suspect, even if the ordinary parish priest did not. Yes?
Another point that I would...
Go ahead.
Another point that I was thinking about as well is that the revolutionaries recognized how much power the church had over the everyday person.
Yeah.
And so they would have the potential to sway. So they wanted to exact an oath from them so that they knew the church was on their side.
Okay.
There was that question of whether the church would really follow along with the revolution.
Okay. All right. I want to come back to that in a moment, Brian.
Yeah, going to what she said, the oath, I don't think the revolutionaries actually even expected the church to have a problem with the oath.
Yes.
Because they voted with them all along.
Yeah.
Okay, they're just going to sign the oath and we're going to continue along.
Okay.
What do you mean you don't sign the oath?
Okay.
Unheard of.
Let's say that Catholic faith was a secondary issue for them, so I assumed that it would be a secondary issue for other supporters of the revolution, including parish priests, so why wouldn't they take the oath? It was a complete miscalculation on their part. Yes?
I think part of it had to do with Enlightenment-style thinking, and part of it had to do with the fact that going all the way back to Charlemagne, the Catholic Church had been kingmakers.
Okay.
And they had basically anointed the Holy Roman monarch from Charlemagne forward. I mean, the wars were fought in England over the very issue.
Yes.
And
But wasn't it easy to exempt the parish priest from
until I
that
started having trouble with it.
accusation? Mm-hmm. Because the parish priest is the son of the peasant.
The parish priest's first fealty is to Rome.
Okay. All right. Sometimes I wonder if the civil constitution of the clergy was not an initiative by the Constituent Assembly to enable parish priests to make a declaration of political loyalty that they assumed the parish priests wanted to make to begin with. Because so many of the parish priests, through the entire process leading up to the formation of the National Assembly, had sided not with the bishop and the archbishop, and therefore with the nobility, but with the Third Estate. So it seems almost like an invitation that they expected would be welcome.
Even in the Declaration of Rights of Man, which came after our Declaration of Independence,
Yeah.
the phrasing was changed from all men are created equal to all men are born equal before the law, or something of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were clearly trying to separate the governance of the people, the republic itself, from any religious foundation. That's probably true. They appealed to a doctrine of natural right. They appealed to a doctrine of natural right that they thought had an affinity with church doctrine, but that they did not derive from church doctrine. That's quite true. That's quite true. So in any case, a tremendous misunderstanding, because the Assembly just did not expect the stink that would arise from the civil constitution of the clergy. And we've seen that some clergy took the oath, some clergy did not take the oath. Some clergy took the oath under pressure from their community. Some clergy did not take the oath under pressure from their community. Within a few years, when the movement of resentment against this had grown, some clergy retracted the oath that they had given in the first place. Some clergy did so under pressure from their community. And so it becomes, well, it's this picture of complexity that influences the whole thing. But no doubt, if there's a general pattern to discern in all this, it's resentment. That the revolution would take upon itself interference in matters of the spirit, which for ordinary people were just different than matters of the law. And resentment. The counter-revolution is a factor of a minority of regions in France. How does the counter-revolution develop out of this? How does the counter-revolution? It's one thing to say, well, there were millions of Catholics who felt misgivings or had resentment against the assembly because of the civil constitution of the clergy. It's another thing to say that they were willing to join some sort of counter-revolutionary army and risk their lives, and in the end face the tremendous severity with which the assembly dealt with them, the convention dealt with them. I mean, how do you see? Yes.
Many of the faithful regarded the new ideas as apocalyptic. They wanted to. They thought this was tremendous thing.
Okay.
These new ideas.
Right. But how does counter-revolution develop out of that? Since we know that, I mean, what you say may characterize some people in every corner of France, but the Vendée is just one province in France. Yes?
Is it that they're rebelling against the rebellers?
Well, that's a good characterization of the counter-revolution. I mean, no doubt the convention felt in 1793, just a moment, revolution is after all our monopoly. You know, who are these peasants out in the Vendée to, you know, in their tens of thousands, constitute an army? Yes, Cameron, and then Erica.
I would have to say it has a lot to do with the decentralization of power, because it's a lot easier to join the movement when there aren't eyes watching around every corner.
Okay. Well, that's a good point. That's a good point. Paris was further away from that part of France than Paris is today in terms of communication, in terms of the possibility of surveillance. A word of caution. One thing that we have found about this revolution is, while it may have strained the loyalty of people in almost every corner of France, this revolution had its agents there as well. You know, the people who signed up for the National Guard, the people who, you know, filled municipal government, and who could be counted on as a kind of first bulwark against counter-revolution, and who often paid with their lives for that, because they were suddenly overwhelmed by peasant rebellion that they had not seen. Yes, Brian?
Some of it wasn't necessarily counter-revolution directly against them. You're a small community out in the middle of nowhere. You got a guy who's overcharging for grain. Yeah, the revolutionaries might support him, but they really don't have a power structure and tax collectors and stuff. So you're just setting up your own government like they told you to, and enforcing him to sell at this price.
Okay.
You play the counter-revolution, but it's their lack of legitimacy and their lack of power to enforce things. You're just taking things on your own like they told you to.
Right. And I think, I mean, that to me extends the issue from a peasantry or a village that rises up against Paris because of a law or a decree that it resists in Paris, to a peasantry or a village that rises up against a local landowner who sells grain at prices above those that the assembly fixed. No doubt if the assemblies, if the convention in this case, had been able to impose its price rules in every corner of France, which it could not, it would have gained back some of the residual support that it lost. Yes?
I think the term counter-revolution, it was a separate movement, a separate sentiment from the emigres, the nobility who had
Yeah.
left the country and were trying to,
Yeah.
you know, what he talks about is the National Assembly sending out small bands of militia-type people to enforce the decrees of the National Assembly.
Yeah.
And people were resisting that.
People were resisting. Tell me why. I mean, that's actually a point I wanted to get to at the end, but you've raised it here, so let's deal with it now. Why does the peasant counter-revolution not fit hand in glove with the emigres in Western Germany, nobility, clergy, who want to foment their own counter-revolution?
The peasants were happy to be rid of the seniority.
All right.
Whatever that phrase is.
Seigneur, yeah. Yeah. That makes it all complicated, doesn't it? Because counter-revolution sometimes says, let us return to the old regime. But there was much of the old regime to which this peasantry never wanted to return, including the monarchy. That's a real paradox about this thing, isn't it? And may well suggest why it is that the National Convention had such an easy way with the reconquest of areas that were falling to counter-revolution. Yes?
Well, another point that McPhee makes is that
You're about a foot too far away from that mic, I just realized. And I know this is going to be a good point.
one of the points that McPhee makes, though, as well, is that the revolutionaries seem to alienate, especially some of the further provinces. I mean,
Yes.
even he talks about language, that they couldn't even speak the same dialect of French and had
Yeah.
to have mediators,
Mhm.
you know, trying
Yeah.
to get people to enforce these decrees.
Okay.
I mean, there's a real conflict or inability to make things go smoothly
Yeah.
between the revolution.
I mean, you too are touching on a point, as Joe was a moment ago, something that I want to return to at the end of the hour. For you, the point is, to what can we return? For you, the point is, this great nation, is it a nation? And what do we mean when we speak of the French nation? I mean, I'm going to shut this door. It's getting a little rowdy out there. But, I mean, Louis XVI had been the king of all that. And no doubt people in every corner of France recognized that they had a king. But because of differences of culture, to some extent religion, there were certainly Protestant communities, for example, in eastern France. Because of language, you know, the French are very hard to lump together to as a nation, which I think shocked and amazed these educated deputies in Paris. Before we go to that, though, one of the things that McPhee has done for us is something that we should not lose sight of, and that is he's carried the story up to 1799 because he included a chapter on the Directory. Now, this is the form of government that took shape after Robespierre fell, after the reign of terror was over. And true to form, because this is France and constitutions were flying out with centrifugal force, there was a constitution in 1795. And the summary that is often offered about the Constitution is that it returned to 1791. What does that mean? What does that mean? Yeah.
Wasn't that the monarchical constitution?
Okay.
It still had an absolute.
Well, it still had a constitutional monarch.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, that it absolutely cannot mean, right? Because this is now a republic. And the men who seize control in Paris and become the guiding forces of the Directory are revolutionaries, Republicans, and in their majority regicides. There is no possibility for them of a return to constitutional law. So in what sense is there a return to 1791? Yes?
Wasn't there a constitution in 1792 that created the whole problem with religion and the priests having to take the oath?
The Civil Constitution of the Clergy, 1790. 1790. Yes, 1790, towards the end of, I think it's November of 1790. Okay. So, well, I mean, why not take the stimulus that Joe gives us here? Are these politicians who have some inclination to accommodate the Catholic Church? I mean, if they're Republicans, if they're regicides, if they're revolutionaries, I mean, they've been caught up in this entire upset about the role of the Catholic Church as well. I mean, in some cases, these are men who sat alongside Robespierre in the Jacobin Club. And if there was blood on his hands, blood on theirs. To some extent, they are men whose calculation in July of 1794 is that the violence was spinning out of control, and Robespierre was so unpredictable that he was bound to turn against them next. But there they are in the directory. So this idea of what you can return back to is a difficult idea. An accommodation of the church? No. An accommodation with the monarchy? Out of the question. So what do they turn back to in 1791?
Putting power in the assembly again? Or
Okay, well, it certainly puts power in the assembly, but who sits in the assembly? Well, I mean, all of that has to be dispensed with. All of that has to be, bring the nobility back in, and in effect, it's a death warrant for these politicians. Bring the emigres back in, it's a death warrant for these politicians. Run down a descendant of the Bourbon dynasty and replace the Bourbon dynasty on the throne, it's a death warrant for these politicians. Those bridges have all been crossed.
But he did talk about the fact that the new government was wealthy.
Yes. 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 You favor the rule of law. You favor the liberty of citizens, except when elections don't turn out your way, and then you purge the assembly. And you revive that old distinction that we talked about a few minutes ago, or a few weeks ago, really, that old distinction between the active and the passive citizen. The active citizen is the one who pays taxation at a level to make visible his stake in government. Underline his, because we certainly have long since shut down the idea of a vote for women. The passive citizen is in possession of all of his rights, minus one, the right to vote. Because the right to vote for the passive citizen suggests more Robespierre, more price fixing, more decrees to the advantage of the poor peasantry as opposed to the peasantry of the middle class, if I can put it that way. And these are men who represent their own wealth and the claim of their own wealth and education to leadership in the state. And that's the sense in which 1795 marks a return to 1791. Do you get an idea of the topsy-turvy world of all this? You want to return, but in effect you've been moving so fast that you're not sure what you can return to. People want stability. There's no question but that is a dominant theme throughout all of this. But where they can seek it is something that transforms due to their own actions. No king, no nobility, no hierarchy of the Catholic Church, men of wealth. Let that be our motto. That, in effect, is the motto of 1795. Why? Well, we've spoken about it. We can demonize, and they could demonize Robespierre all they want, but to some extent Robespierre became the violent leader that he became because of this embrace that he entered into with the sections, with the clubs, with the National Guard in Paris. I don't want to say that they put him up to his violence, But I do want to say that the cries, you know, off with his head, off with his head, off with his head, often originated in this embrace of the popular masses in Paris. And that's what the men of 1795 saw when they saw democracy, one man, one vote, the influence of the sans-culottes. That's what they saw, and they wanted to break it. Defend for me the proposition that one man, one vote meant interference with the rights of property, as someone in 1795 might have wanted to defend that proposition. Yes?
Majority of men own no property.
Okay. So how do we get from their lack of ownership of property to the idea that they would interfere with the rights of those who?
They're nincompoops. They're trying to take my land.
All right.
Once they have the vote, they're going to take my power.
Okay.
I
And
have left.
is there any evidence that that would be the result of full democracy, one man, one vote? Okay. How about evidence in 1795 from the standpoint of a property owner who wants to secure his property? Is there any evidence that that's what democracy will tend to?
Yeah.
Yes, all over. Yes.
And didn't you have to own property to vote in like prior times? Like, right? Is that right? Didn't property owners get a right to vote like before 1795? Like before the whole
In 1791, yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, if you give everybody a vote, that kind of takes away some of the benefits of owning property, right?
Right. It takes away the political benefit because giving everyone, they think, oh, this is the Jacobins all over again. This is the maximum general. This is the price fixing of, you know, whether we've had a good harvest or a bad harvest, we have to sell our grain at such and such a price. The Jacobins sent, of course, armed troops out into sections of the countryside to confiscate grain, to bring them into the city for sale, to bring grain into the city for sale. That action was replicated in various areas of France. And that had become then an expectation that ordinary people had, you know, of whatever background. If they needed bread at a lower price in order to be able to eat, then they expected that bread at a lower price. I mean, the Jacobins had created that basic expectation. And so 1795 is an effort to break that expectation and to use the power of the state to break it. I want to, of course, I mean, the popularity of the new regime then, you know, it fails to deliver what the Jacobins promised to deliver, even if the Jacobins never quite did. It imposes high taxes, and all of this at a time, you know, history just wants to work this way, of poor harvests, which of course by the basic law of supply and demand meant high prices. So there are food riots, confrontations between the authorities and rioters throughout the period 1795 to 1798. I want to read to you now just one passage from this book, and then we can go on to other subjects. I want to read to you now this. It struck me as I was getting ready for class today as one that encapsulates. In fact, it's a passage that is of two parts. The one part is a quotation of a speech given in 1796 by a landowner. It's page 190. And then the next paragraph goes into this entire question of the control of land. The control of land that we have seen at the basis of peasant concern throughout this. Middle of 190. In his repeated speeches to those assembled at the Directory's festivals, landowners such as Baudon Badois in Alençon and others like him across the country articulated a narrative of a revolution they believed to have concluded. Have you noticed before that the revolutionaries at various points wanted to draw the revolution to an end at the moment when it favored them. And that's been a theme throughout, hasn't it? And it never has quite worked. This is like the roller coaster gone out of control. Over 2 days, on 9 to 10 Thermidor, year 4, in other words, 28th to 29th July 1796, he gave his audience a history of the revolution. Now, mind you, here are villagers beckoned to hear the speech of a local landowner. The most odious feudal tyranny and arbitrary authority had in 1789 confronted French citizens in whose hearts liberty had germinated. What's that mean? Imagine yourself as a villager and you hear this, given in a ceremony, delivered, no doubt, in a ceremonial manner by a local landowner. Right? An interpretation of the past, 1789, an odious feudal tyranny and arbitrary authority. Well, who were these villains in 1789? Pardon?
The nobles.
Okay, the nobles. All right? Okay, let's put our feet on firm ground. 1789 was an uprising against the nobility, says this Bourdon Badois, okay? French, in whose hearts liberty had germinated. So it was simple. It was simple. It was a belief in liberty against feudal tyranny. All right? The revolution was good. It was good. We need to return to 1789 as a point with which we can all identify. After long struggles with internal and external enemies, it was only at the moment when the monarchy was overthrown that France reconquered its independence and freedom. So what else was good then? I mean, pin that comment on a time when the monarchy was overthrown that France reconquered its independence and freedom. What's he referring to? Not 1789, I assume. Yes?
Killed the king, right?
Okay, okay. 1792 marks the beginning of the Republic. The king is in prison, and the king will be executed, what would it be, 4 months later. All right, so wrap those events together, and you're still on the firm footing of things that are good. You know, a legacy that we can live with. But at the moment of the Republic's triumph, here we come. Misconstrued patriotism, demagogic ignorance, and anarchy delivered France to factionalism. Suddenly a shadow has been cast where only the sun had shone. What's happened? As this local notable delivers a speech that is a kind of thumbnail sketch of the last 7 years of history. Yes?
Selfish divisions.
Okay.
And these factions and their selfishness threaten the very idea of the revolution.
Okay, okay. And when you hear factionalism, based on the study so far, who do you think of? Pardon?
The Girondins and the...
Okay, all right, there we go, there we go. Brissot, Robespierre, Gironde Mountain, these, the troubles within the, that would be the central one that we have studied. So it was as though this man wanted time to stop in 1792. A good moment when they had done away with the monarchy, secured liberty, and let that be the end of it. What is misconstrued patriotism? Who can be accused of misconstrued patriotism? Okay, being loyal to the wrong thing. Who was loyal to the wrong thing?
Anybody who's your enemy.
Pardon?
Anybody who's your enemy.
Okay.
You got it wrong.
Okay. But that sounds to me like a characterization of, well, whom?
Well,
yes.
So at this point, this is where we're seeing like the split between the Girondins and
Okay.
the Montagnards.
Okay.
But I think like it kind of goes back to like the whole great fear aspect of the entire revolution.
Okay.
If you had any doubt in your minds, I mean, the smallest percent, some leaders would just automatically guillotine. And I mean, it was just kind of, like he said,
Right.
if they're not vocally and physically with you at that moment, then you don't know if they're your ally or your enemy or what. So
Or if they stand for France.
yeah,
If
yeah.
they stand for the revolution.
Yeah.
You make me glad at this moment, when I was toying with the idea before class began, would I start with McPhee or would I start with Tackett? And I'm glad at this moment that I started with Tackett, because he's the one that I think gives us a real referent to that comment. It's the way the the Girondins treated the Mountain, and the way the Mountain treated the Girondins within the fold of the Jacobin Club. And demagogic ignorance? What about that? Who would have been the demagogue? Yes, Robespierre. I mean, if I have to put a face on it, and I know that this is coming from a landowner in 1796, I think it's Demon Robespierre. And anarchy. How can Robespierre, who was at the same time a dictator, be associated with anarchy? Yes?
Because he was associated with the masses.
All right, okay. So he's a funny character from the standpoint of this landowner, and I would go so far as to say from many in France, he's a character with a Janus face, a dual aspect. On the one hand, he exercises all power through his Committee of Public Safety. He has the power of life and death over enemies, real or presumed, against the revolution. But on the other hand, he seems to be the puppet of popular forces that he simply cannot free himself from. An alliance that he cannot, well, he does not want to break, but he cannot in any way attenuate. So Robespierre is a funny figure, but he certainly in 1796, hard not to imagine that he's the referent in this comment. Let's go on. Only when the convention overthrew a tyranny that was particularly dangerous because it wore the mantle of popularity could France have a social pact that now protected it against both royalism and anarchy. Aha. Now, we've seen the word tyranny in this speech once before, the most odious feudal tyranny, which touches the king, and it seems to touch also the seigneurial system, the nobility, the landowning nobility. Here I get tyranny particularly dangerous because it wore the mantle of popularity. Well, who wore the mantle of popularity? Robespierre. I mean, he was to some extent the darling of the crowd. They would call for the blood of so-and-so, and the blood of so-and-so would come. Now there is a social pact which protects France against royalism, all right. France is a republic, and anarchy. This tendency to reach for the masses. Finally, France has reached its repose as a fraternal people practicing the social and civic virtues. Offhand, you're a villager. You've heard this speech. It was nicely delivered. No one's given you enough wine that you can't pay attention. And what do you think? Yes?
Don't you like, I mean, this revolution overthrew one thing we had, there were some threats to it, but we overcame it.
Yeah.
So now we stand on top.
Yeah.
Isn't that really the general message?
Okay, the general message. Do you receive that general message in the evident intention?
I mean, as a villager with no other knowledge of the situation, yes.
Okay,
I mean,
but I'm saying you're a peasant who in the village who's brimming over with other information about the situation.
I mean, probably not, because, I mean, there's much more to the story than that.
Much more to the story. It's a kind of sanitized version of the first 7 years of the revolution. There was a hand here. Yes?
I think a certain segment, perhaps not as readily informed, would receive some solace from that. It actually would receive some solace from that.
All right. Okay, so the tone of completion, stability.
So finally, we're not going to kill our neighbors. We might have a couple of years where families can thrive and we can attend to our social and civic duties.
Mm-hmm. I mean, no doubt if this leader of this village gets that message across, he's achieved his objective. Yes?
Beware mob rule. Don't just take a popularity and go against maybe those in charge know what they're doing, which is the ruler of the village.
Okay.
Is trying to say, hey, maybe sometime when you're all motivated to rise up against me, let this be a lesson. Anarchy is not a good thing.
Okay. Now, yes.
Oh, I was just gonna say, actually, it seems to me that it's interesting that this guy is a landowner talking to peasants
Yeah.
in the same way that a noble would have talked to his peasants. It
Okay.
seems like it's kind of this repeat of previous concerns. As a peasant, I would wonder, okay, am I really better off?
Okay. And now I want to lead into the next paragraph. Because the next, I mean, if I were the editor, I would have said, I'm not sure that this is a suitable transition, but look to what Peter McPhee transitions into. At the same time that political power at the local level was hardening in the hands of local notables like Baudon-Badois, the remaining émigré land came onto the market. All right, so we have a new body of land purchases, a new group of land purchases. Earlier sales of such land had often been to the less wealthy, favored by Jacobin policies, allowing subdivision and long-term repayments. In other words, the Jacobins, whatever else one thinks about them, had tried to favor lesser peasantry in land sales so far through policies of in effect, mortgage policies and also policies of land division. You know, the peasant who can't buy an entire estate can join together with 30 others. It's divided 30 ways, and the purchase becomes possible. All right. Now, a return to larger scale sales advantaged those with ready savings. Tenant farmers and better off peasants were also able to take advantage of the escalating prices paid for their produce to buy, escalating because of the scarcity we have spoken about and the elimination of these price controls. To buy land, clear taxes, and pay off leases. In contrast, subsistence-oriented leasers of small plots faced rising rents as landowners began to reimpose the bourgeois tithe, adding the value of the old tithe paid to the church to the rents they charged. Okay? So the landowner simply looked at it that way. Well, if you paid a tithe to begin with, that's so much material resource that you could pay under a new regime today. So you owe it to me. Resolutely committed to a laissez-faire economy, the regime also sought to impose agrarian individualism and legal hegemony for the rights of private property. No government since 1789 had been willing to confront directly the ancient mesh of communal controls over forest resources, gleaning commons, use of uncultivated land and rights of access across private land. Now the Directory acted to legislate for the priority of the rights of the individual owner of private property in forests and on harvested or uncultivated land, and encouraged the sale of common lands by auction. Okay, let's just boil this down to the issue of common lands. I mean, this was a tradition that existed unbroken up to 1789. In other words, here's the village, here's the estate, of the seigneur of whatever type it is. Here's perhaps property of the church. Here's a royal forest. And here are common lands. And by tradition, the peasantry had thought that it had some right to common land. You have sheep, graze your sheep on the common land. You need wood, take wood from the common land. You need wood for fences or for fire or whatever you need it for, there it is. Now the question becomes, since property is the order of the day, whose property should it be, or should it be property at all? That's the question. And I put before you in outline three possibilities. One, you sale it to a purchaser with ready cash, and that's it. Two, you maintain a right of common access to land for purposes such as the ones I just listed. Three, you divide them out in parcels for individual ownership. As a peasant, which do you like the best, or which do you like the least? That is, a peasant without a great deal of means. Yes, Ryan.
The peasant like to keep the common land because they obviously can't afford to buy it, and they use it quite frequently.
Okay. Keep the common land. Keep the common land. And what would be the second best choice?
probably parcel it out to everybody else.
Okay, parcel it out, you know, we can somehow, and give us a long lease and, you know, favorable terms, and we'll have a bit of this land, and we could at least, you know, put that bit of it to the use that we need. Okay. And the least favorable would be to see all of the land that the peasant thinks he or his family, he or she, have a claim to hand it all to the large landowner. That would be the least. Now, the reason I made a snide comment earlier about the lack of a transitional device between paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 is that I think your author needed to make explicit that he was explaining how these villagers would hear this version of the revolution as having come to a felicitous end in 1796. How would they see it?
Some finality with the death of Robespierre.
Okay. Okay. I mean, Robespierre has used up all his political capital. I mean, his demonization is quite general in rural France in 1796. And I doubt when peasants look back on, let's say, laws that would give them favorable terms in which to buy lands at auction, I doubt that they think of that as the good that Robespierre did. I mean, he really has, he has wrecked, I think, the reputation of the Jacobins for most peasants. Yes.
I
Go
was
ahead.
just going to say, it seems like, I mean, I kind of stick with my point is that the peasant would be concerned with, okay, well, what now?
Okay.
What is being instituted now?
Mhm.
There is a continuity of, okay, from 1789 we've been in chaos and it still
Yeah.
hasn't quite been resolved.
Yeah, yeah.
We still have concerns, we still have issues regarding property, land.
Okay. Yeah, that's very good. That's very good. Let's say that there's a general issue here that we could put our hands upon, and that is time. Let's say that when we look at these revolutions, we're focused upon the peasantry now, but when we look at these revolutionaries, they want to repeatedly. It's been a theme of the course so far. They want to stop time, or they want to reverse time. And let's say that that can be a common factor, at least of the modern world, that people want to stop it, or they want to reverse it. And I say the modern world because well, I would not like to presume what ordinary people thought in the Middle Ages, because I to begin with, do not know. And B, it does seem to me that if you follow McPhee, you get the idea that the peasantry has been beckoned to the idea that it can actually be an agent in its own life. So the idea of stopping time, putting a halt to change at a given time, putting things in reverse to some earlier state of affairs, that would seem conceivable in a way that perhaps in the 1780s or 1770s or before, it would not have seemed conceivable. You just, you know, there was your lot in life. Once in a while, you engaged in the satisfaction of some massive riot, and you know, paid whatever consequences were doled out. But this idea that you could somehow stop time or revert to an earlier point in time would have been hard to imagine. I put that before you as a hypothesis. Needless to say, I've not conducted a poll among the peasants of the 1790s to offer you as evidence. Is this a situation that is common? I mean, is it somehow unique in some special focus in your minds in the French Revolution in the 1790s? Or are there things in your life that you can connect this with? I wish I could, and you look at the history around you, because that, of course, is ongoing. I wish we could, yes?
Yeah, conservatives and liberals today, I'm more conservative. I look back and I'm like, man, I wish they didn't have the gun control laws. I wish they didn't have this. Let's go back to the way it was this one issue. You have other people, I mean, who are for gay the way am I going back to this? Have progress. You have conservatives and liberals today that want to keep moving, and conservatives have issues they want to move forward. It depends on the issues today. Sometimes you're like, hey, let's move forward. Other times you're like, man, those were the good old days.
Then let me extend the question. One of the things that I think comes out of a study of the 1790s is that that's all quite futile. That the desire to return is often a contradictory desire. You want to return to the old regime? Fine. Bring the nobility in and let them hang you from the highest tree. You think they're going to look? You think they're going to indulge you in the fact that you took part in a riot from which someone in their family was killed in the course of the revolution? It becomes the whole idea of a return becomes very fraught. And this, go ahead, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say that it seems like you can draw a broad pattern of humanity doesn't like change. And so the larger, the more transformative the nature of the change, the more it's going to want to resist.
Okay.
And it does have this kind of selective memory of like, okay, can we revert back to when it was a lot simpler, when I could just go to this common land to get my own wood? And they kind of say, okay, this was what it should have been like. But they also aren't taking into account, well, I used to have to pay these seigneurial dues. I had this certain, lot in life. I wasn't participating in my government. I mean, so I think in terms of, like, you can relate that to so many different moments in history.
Okay.
In terms of change. When is change happening and how do people respond to it?
Okay. And the past is then romanticized. I mean,
Rose-colored glasses. Yeah.
Okay, rose-colored glasses. You want to return to what you remember.
Right.
As opposed to as to what was troublesome at the time.
Right.
Okay. What some of the rest of you think of this? I mean, it's a kind of exhibit of a tendency that strikes me as being very common of the modern period. I want to stop this right now, because this is the point in time in which I draw my advantage, or the people with whom I identify draw advantage, or I want to return to some situation that is selectively remembered. Both strike me as impossible to pull off. What do you think? How does this? Yes.
Well, I think they're impossible to pull off because if you do revert back, you ruin all the progress you made in the 6 years or however long it was, and people don't like throwing away X amount of years of progress. Yeah. So, I mean, once you get to a point, it's near impossible to go back to what the old way was, because that's just throwing away whatever you did before.
Okay. And the French peasantry is a banner example of that.
Yeah.
They've had their feudal obligations lifted off their shoulders. And to go back wholesale means the restoration of those obligations. Okay. What do you think about all this, Erica? I mean, what can you connect this with? Then or now?
Like back then, there's so many people whose lives were affected. And then moving forward in ongoing years with the Revolutionary Wars, as we saw with the papers that we wrote, I mean, they were just a few people, how their attitudes, their thoughts, their goals, how they looked at life were so different in just a few quick span
Which
of
one did you
years.
write about, if I may?
Colson.
Okay, right.
I mean, some maybe were more effective than others, but I think they must have looked at this period and just, I don't know, I think maybe just almost in disbelief, like, wow, this really happened,
I mean, you mentioned it, it's almost a factor with Colson. This is the agent of a nobleman living in, do I have him right? Okay, yeah, I mean, you describe what for me would be almost a process of acceleration in change, that he's quickly casting off values and attitudes that he thought were more or less permanent, and that this is ongoing all the way through these years. Yeah, so I guess one thing you'd say, you want to return in time? Fine, you wouldn't fit, because you've changed so much. Yes?
Yeah, the majority of the French underclass had no determination So now that they've been granted some kind of
Yeah.
period of self-determination and how to make something a life for themselves that wasn't going to look like their fathers
Yeah.
was something of such illumination. I don't think we're going to have.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. And sort of, it kind of belies this idea of nostalgia, that underneath you have become so obligated to the changes that have been made that in the end, say what you may, you don't want to go back either. Your hand had been up, I think, Joe.
I think at any given point in time, there are the people who are steering events in their own favor
Yeah.
and the people who are disaffected.
Okay.
And
And probably lots of people in between,
yeah,
but go ahead.
and then there are a lot of people who are going to see in change what they hope will come of it.
Yeah.
So, you know, the peasantry, I don't think you could ever say they had it good.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe they moved from having to pay seigneurial dues to having to pay higher rents.
Yeah.
But they had it about the same.
Okay. Okay.
You know, but they had the hope that this change was going to lead to their
Mm-hmm.
liberation and prosperity.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this time in the French Revolution, it was so dynamic, they were not yet at a place where it was stable enough for it to stop.
Let me ask you this. If you were to be in rural France on July the 14th, 2016, and there were, you know, celebration, fireworks, what would you expect people in rural France to be celebrating out of this time?
Well, if you were the wealthier landowner and you were benefiting from the sale of church lands,
Yeah.
and you were benefiting, even though you were a former third estater, then you might think life was better.
Okay.
But somebody was talking about common lands. If you're the one who had lost the place where you grazed your sheep,
Okay.
kind of sucked.
All right. Okay. Okay. But today, in 2016, I mean, I don't mean to presume a knowledge of contemporary French rural life that I don't have, but I would suppose that the access to common land for your sheep is no longer the question of life and death that it was in 1796. I assume that that's been all more or less regulated, and maybe the children have long since moved to Paris or Lyon or Marseille and are computer programmers.
Right.
But one way or another, that's all been sorted out. And my question is, what then can you celebrate in the French Revolution? Yes.
Celebrating the same type of thing we celebrate every 4th of July, the independence from.
All right. All right. All right. So tyranny was cast off, and Louis XVI is our equivalent to King George, or their equivalent to our King George. Yes.
It's a glorification of the past, nothing actually substantive that you can point
Okay.
to and say, well, this is it, but we sure love what happened, and it's a feeling of innate patriotism.
Okay. Yes.
I figure they'd be celebrating universal male suffrage.
Okay.
Extended the vote to peasant classes.
Okay. So a vote for Robespierre, since it was, after all, his constitution that offered them that, even if he never acted upon it, which is another thing that Robespierre did that never was acted upon. Yes.
Well, I mean, I think of it the same way we celebrate the 4th of July, like romanticizing it, because like when we celebrate
Yeah.
the 4th of July, we don't think of how we enslaved the entire race for another 100 years.
Okay.
We think of that we created this brand new country.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the same with the French. I mean, this is when these ideas came about. They don't think about how they slaughtered 10,000 people in the streets of Paris.
Okay. Okay. So they don't have all that in mind. Yeah.
I'm thinking maybe they're celebrating the steps that led to the country that they live in now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that wasn't like, it may not have been the only thing that changed the country, but it was one of the steps that brought them to the world that we all live in.
Okay. Okay. So some idea that the world has gotten better and the French Revolution put us in this course, and with setbacks, And with turmoil along the way, here we are, and that's what we celebrate. That may be something like the truth, yeah.
Isn't the French Revolution kind of the point where what we think of as modern nationalism started?
Yeah, which is a paradox because the French acted as though it was not the point that it started, but the premise for what they did. That we already are a nation and we've decided to take the control into our own hands. In fact, we call ourselves the National Assembly. And they bump against the hard reality that you just mentioned. Yes, Brian?
Freedom and liberty. Even if people don't control their own destiny, the wisdom they do. And that was a lot of what the revolution was all about, is we're in control, we're in control.
Okay.
Even if the National Assembly was in control, people weren't.
Okay.
If you can convince them they're in control, hey, you finally have say in your own life.
Okay, okay. I mean, that may be the basis on which people would celebrate today. Let's take, 10 minutes, come back at 3:05 and take up this issue of the nation.
Reading through the early part of the reading, we just read that some of the peasants were happy because they
Oh, you made 2 copies. Yeah. We're gonna guillotine. You just cut down another entire tree.
I did.
Okay, you know what? Give me your Comcast.
Why did you
Spell it.
I know. Well, there's some terms that have started to
So you translate it to English?
we did like 5 ads.
Alright.
One the judge. I mean, it's just easier to have
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's not easier, it's just cheaper.
Construction workers broke a water pipe.
It said mail sent successfully.
Okay.
So.
If people here just don't know what they're doing.
Who comes into it when I have, So is this gonna work now? Yeah, here we are. Do you?
Yeah, she just sent it to me through my Comcast, and I'm going to see, and then I'm gonna go print it out right now.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
So and then you can respond to her. How much time are you gonna need to respond?
Oh, not long at all. I'm
Week or something like
to comment. Oh, I can do it today
that? Okay.
or tonight. I just have work, and I don't get done till 9:15 exactly.
Well, let's just say by the end of the week.
Okay.
So that we can- Oh, she being, yeah, okay, now this is the other case. Okay. Where is it? That's right, you're the one with the pictures. Oh, yeah.
Ah, yes, I got it.
Yeah, send me the pictures, I'll help her up with that. Looks like an old document, like a document of a monk. In the form that I saw. Send me the pictures.
Oh.
Already on your side.
Really did? Believe it. I don't know, it affects you that close. Usually it doesn't. Like, usually I'm fine, and usually I have my inhaler, so I'm just like.
That's fine.
But like,
I get these things in here, I mean, I do this.
He wants me to send it back to you, or?
no, he wants you, cause
Yeah,
you're
the
supposed to
sheets.
not turn in your final
That's just the
draft
way I do
until
it.
you look at my
So you do
comments.
And change it.
Yeah, so just read it and then like fix a few things.
Okay.
Okay. And I've seen them in different forms. I mean, some people write all their comments in one hand.
Yeah, usually I'm fine, and it's not a big deal, but it's just.
At the end of the semester, we should have a revolutionary party with lots of wine, French food.
Ooh, that would be nice.
You put up one of those May trees.
There we go, maple.
Regular peanut butter?
The goddess of nature. I will dance frivolously naked throughout the patio area here. Yeah.
Like I said, it usually doesn't bother me. It was just today. It was just like.
Maybe not. Okay.
Alright, see you later. Bye. Bye.
You're okay to drive it.
Speaking as you do, you should rehydrate. It's a good plan.
There we go.
Oh my gosh.
What happened to your hair?
Chopped it.
I know.
Who is it? It's,
Anybody ever tell you, did you ever see Get Smart?
yes.
You look exactly like Barbara Feldman.
Oh,
Okay.
really?
Rolling World on that show, you remember that?
Yeah, I've seen some of the episodes of like the old, like the
Oh, right.
original Get Smart. Yeah.
Right.
Oh.
I've never actually been told that. That's good. I'll take that as a compliment.
And you should. What? Got our assignments in, did well. Thank you for your help.
Very welcome. Yeah.
Everybody in that World War II class?
Do you know who?
Is that what you're talking about?
No, actually, we are. No, I know. Almost everybody, but
Oh.
no, I was his referee for
Yeah.
the paper.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, yeah.
We
I was
went
like,
to school together.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
both worked.
There we go.
Both went to school together.
I'm just so used to you talking about your World War II class.
I know. Well, I have a bunch of people.
And then
on.
I had a second.
You're in my World War II. Yeah.
Much as I've heard from everyone, once I take it. Luckily, I have my first-hand accounts from my dad. His little map from lovely 18 months he spent in Britain before
Let me think of his name.
going over. That was the fun part. Okay, you know, when you had over 2 million American troops in Britain, just having fun. Okay, yeah.
True. Yeah. My grandfather was faced
And
out
then
of
he was D-Day +9
wow.
when he got there, and his little track took him all the way from near Berchtesgaden into Czechoslovakia by the end of the war.
Wow. What
He was like a speed.
division?
Tech sergeant, technical sergeant, signal corps.
You could read this book in like 30 minutes.
He's the old man. Yeah, he was 39 and 45. by the end of the
Wow.
war.
Yeah, my grandfather was a
Are you?
pilot.
It's worse
And
than
he
that.
actually was one of the people that bombed Dresden. Yeah. But he lied about his age. Right? He was Air Force.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is yeah, he was. Let's see here. I think he was 16 when he enlisted and said he was 18 or whatever he had to be to a French.
so common.
Yeah. It was really, yeah, it was really common. But yeah, his division had like the most number of rungs for the least amount of casualties, or something
Well,
like
that's
that.
good, because the mortality rate in the Air Force is extremely high.
It was really crazy. I mean, you know, they would get hit by flak or whatever almost every run, but
Yeah, Germans had some great defensive measures.
right. But yeah, we have his old
Okay,
log books
thank you,
of, like,
thank
all the
you.
runs
I
that
appreciate
How
it.
cool is that?
Yeah,
That's nice.
it's really cool.
My grandpa was a product of the Korean War, aka the most overlooked war in U.S. history. I mean, like, there are just some things that you just don't learn about in high school. And, like, for me, the Korean War is that. I don't know a single. Of course, I've forgotten most of them.
Extremely dangerous. We were fighting Chinese troops, fighting Soviet troops. Anything could have happened at any time.
Just watch MASH.
First real, like, hot war, film war. Everything else, but yeah, I think it gets overlooked because of Vietnam. I wonder, but definitely was a huge, long and brutal war.
I just don't like war. Okay. Who does?
What's it good for?
Mr. Putin. Mr. Kim.
Here we go. Okay, thank you.
Hey,
Class.
bring my laptop. You show me how you did that comment.
Oh, I was freaking out. I was just like, I started sweating, and I was like, wow. I was
You highlight it, and then you could write on the side.
Yeah.
I would love to know how to do that, because that was the coolest thing. I could do that with one.
Oh, that's why my card. My book.
Just insert comment.
I have very rudimentary skills with it.
This,
People are really good.
this question of the nation. Let us ponder this question of the nation. Someone give me, recapitulate this for me. The French called themselves the National Assembly. I mean, the adjective refers to a noun, presumes the existence of a nation, of which the assembly is the representative, and this then becomes the basis for a constitution that secures for the nation those rights, and so on and so forth. Why is that such a difficult constellation to think of historically? Yes?
Well, originally, when the king called the Estates General together, part of the idea was representation to be elected from each region.
Okay.
There was a form of democratic republic institution.
You mean in 1789, or you mean back in the Middle
At
Ages?
its inception, and then the Third Estate became the National Assembly.
Oh, in
But
1789, right.
At its inception, that's the way it was. By the time of 1796 or whatever it wasn't anything like that at all. But that is the sort of self-determination part of it, is that by some way, people are participating in government of the nation. As
Okay.
opposed to a monarch who rules everything, and then there's just this nobility all around.
In that formulation, self-determination, who in this case, to look back to France, 1789, is the self in question?
Well, there's still people with enough money to be a part of the local community's nominating process. It wasn't the peasantry.
Okay, I mean, we've certainly made our peace with the idea that by the time the election proceeded through these various stages, there was a winnowing out process, and the bourgeoisie, be they government officials or professional men like lawyers and so forth, they were the ones who actually took their seats. In the name of whom? In the name of the nation. And what is the nation at this point? What is the nation? What is the nation? There's a famous pamphlet by Sieyès, the politician, Abbé Sieyès, the politician, in 1709. Qu'est-ce que la nation? What is the nation? He answered that the Third Estate is the nation. That can seem to you historically, in retrospect, problematic. What is the nation?
seems like it's kind of this, which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Okay.
Because the nationalist movement, right, with the National Assembly, makes their case based on the idea of a nation beforehand. But then the nation doesn't really exist until it's got an assembly to represent it.
Okay.
But I feel like there's common factors that the French, and I know nationalist movements generally rely on, like, common language, common ethnicity, common cultural background, and shared history.
Okay. And we seem to be saying that there was not enough of that in 1789 for the French really to be a nation. And that this process by which a nation formed out of the existence of the National Assembly took longer than a day. I mean, what would, maybe look at this from the other angle to begin with. Let's not worry about whether there was or was not a French nation consisting of 26 or 28 millions. Let's imagine the nation that these 600 deputies in Paris, or at first at Versailles and then at Paris, actually represented. Whom did they represent? Who was their nation?
Peasantry.
The peasantry. All right, but we've already made our peace with the idea that the peasantry had next to no direct representation among them. Even peasant grievances were dropped as the lists of grievances ascended from village level to district level, and then on to Paris, because politicians at the district level, or simply notables at the district level, said, don't include that. That looks like the peasants wrote it. Yes?
Large cities, more working classes, where they got their power from, the Parisians revolt.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, that certainly develops. That certainly develops that in the large cities there grow a mass of people around them. And let's say if you asked Robespierre, not in 1789, but in 1793, who is this nation that you really represent? He might have simply pointed out to the streets of Paris and said, the sans-culottes, look around. Yes?
It's a construct of the National Assembly itself.
Okay.
Because even some of the provinces would have said, no, we're not.
Okay. And on what grounds would they have said, no, we're not?
Ethnic and language and...
All right. Okay. So we really start with a fable, a myth, to put a word on it. Well, let's slide under all of this the hypothesis that people have some degree of identification with somebody more than their own immediate family. And if the nation, if that level of identification is being blocked by some other levels, what other levels? Then who are these people in their identification if they are not French? Who are the French if they're not French, if you follow my meaning?
But, I mean, they might identify on a provincial level. They
All
might
right.
consider themselves,
Okay.
or Basques, or,
Okay.
I can't
Good. Alsatians.
Alsatians.
All right. We belong to the province of Alsace. Okay? I was in the province of Alsace this summer, and I became aware that their symbol is what looked to me like a crane. In other words, the bird, a crane, that they embroidered that, for example, into dishcloths that I brought back as gifts for families and friends. They're quite strikingly well done. And I have no idea when that began, but let's presume that began before 1789, and that the Alsatians were those who identified with this figure of the crane. Yes?
Actually, today in France, they're having this huge problem where they're regrouping the provinces and renaming
Okay.
them for like electoral reasons.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are angry because of the names they're giving them are mostly acronyms.
Oh,
They're like,
people don't
this
learn
doesn't
from
make any
history.
sense.
Yeah.
Like, I'll still remember it as whatever name it was before.
Yeah.
So weird.
Yeah, I mean, imagine you live in Paris and you become suddenly a member of the Department of the Seine because that's the name of the river that flows through. And you and I live in Monument.
Which bank of the river you're on?
Okay.
How come they fish over there and do this and we do this?
Okay. And that becomes even more local than the perspective that Amy suggested a moment ago. Because in provincial, at least you can't see the edge of the land with which you identify yourself. But if it's a matter of which bank of the river, then the one bank people on the one can look to the other, and it becomes a very, very local, very, very local manner of identification. You suggest provincial. Is there anything beyond the bounds of what today we would call France that could engage anyone's loyalty? Would anyone have said they're members of Western civilization? No doubt no. What would they have said they're members of that? To what do they belong?
They were subjects of a king.
A subject of the king. They certainly knew they were subjects of the king. And that binds them to him. Does it bind them to each other? That's the question. When we say the French, we imagine a strong, effective bond of those who live there, those who speak that tongue, those who identify and are identified as the French. Yes?
Oh. The question changed a little bit, but to me, you go all around the perimeter of France, and even today there are borders. But you talked about a place where you lived in Germany that used to be French. There are areas of France that
Yes.
used to be, it's still German
All
on
right.
the signs, and the names are German. And,
Yeah.
you know, down by Spain, the same thing. Up along the English Channel, it's. So I think there's lots of places where people think more of their local identity than they do the national identity. Even in the
Okay.
United States, there's a lot of people who think Texas is its own entity.
Okay.
You know, or Southern
Okay.
California or wherever.
Okay. So if we think about the lingering effects of regionalism or localism today, in the framework that is given by a country, the government of a country, I mean, think of how much more intense those were in the 1790s. What would begin to mitigate that? What would begin to change that? How do people who in the end have a common relationship to the King of France, what brings them together horizontally and not just in this vertical relationship? Yes?
With war,
Yeah.
with other countries,
All right.
brought them together.
All right. You know what in Germany they referred to the army in the late 19th century, not in the late 18th century, as die Schule der Nation, the school of the nation. And the idea is that this problem of regionalism, which was as profound in Germany as it was in France, was overcome by the fact that there emerged a national army, so that peasants and workers from Baden and Württemberg and Bavaria and Mecklenburg and every corner from Germany came together in military service. And that's what began to bind them together. You know, I have a habit. I start on the subject of another country and it always ends up in Germany. I apologize for that. Except that I've been in therapy for it and I can't shed the habit.
Germany has a central role in the 20th century.
Yeah, well, Germany does have a central role in the Senate, but I really should get back to France. But I remember distinctly, a moment, a conversation that I was having in the Rhineland with a man several years my senior. I would have been maybe about 30 when this conversation took place. And we were talking about the Rhineland, which is a largely Catholic region. And of course, the dynasty that took power in Germany was from Prussia and therefore Protestant. And I said to him, well, just when do you think this region became German as opposed to, its own separate region with an attitude of resistance to Prussian dominance? So he looked at me as though the question invited so obvious an answer that the question didn't need to be put in the first place. And he said, 1914, of course. The war, the outbreak of the First World War. Now, as an historian, I would question that. I would put it back into the late 19th century, but not too far back into the late 19th century. Because it seems to me that the Germans weren't German yet for most of the 19th century. And we're looking back at a time when the French were not French yet. And that makes this all very murky, very murky. These problems are ongoing, for goodness sake. You point to, you know, is Texas America? That's, that's a good question. I mean, by and large, I assume the answer is yes, but at least it's a question. But think back in history, and you'll see when there really is no basis of unity, or a slender basis of unity, people to people who are being identified as members of the nation. Yes?
You're bringing this point up, but he actually talks about how in regions of France, that obligation to military service was actually a point of division.
Yes.
Because there were whole sections, the Pyrenees, where people may have been pressed into service by the local militia, but they deserted and went back home.
Yeah. They wouldn't show up for the, you know, for the enlistment, and they desert either on the way to their regiment or once they got there. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, we can speak about war, the military, as a means of ironing over differences among people from different places, but not if the people don't show up for the for the military to begin with. I mean, it really. But then, I mean, to get the focus back onto France, we are speaking with the Directory about a regime that not only was able to stay in power for 5 years, which is longer than the Jacobins had, but waged war and to tremendous success. That's what we're speaking about. That enough of these peasant recruits showed up and constituted an army, you know, under leadership of, for example, Napoleon Bonaparte, the soldier of the revolution, that France was able to have stirring victories elsewhere in Europe to clear French land of enemy forces, Spanish, for example, Austrian, but also to force Prussia to a peace, the Peace of Basel in 1795, and to begin, you know, I mean, we in effect telescope history to put it this way, but to begin a policy of conquest in, for example, Germany. Yes?
It's the first time this idea that a nation, the people of a nation embodied the sum total of the nation.
You're absolutely right. And if, you know, if military history can in some way be characterized as a series of arms races, this was a moment in the arms race when the nation, with its passion, with its patriotism, begins to be seen as a military asset. Fewer mercenaries. I mean, it's not perfect by any means. It's not perfect by any means, and there remain foreign troops, often foreign troops that are forced into service because of French occupation of the area they're from. Yeah. Well, when we start talking about war and we start talking about France expanding its borders, and we start talking about France as an occupation force, it seems to me that we do start talking about the knitting together of a nation that is going to take some time. When I was in graduate school, a book that everyone read was called, what was it called now? Peasants into Frenchmen, I think, by an historian by the name of Eugen Weber. And the argument was that, well, it was national schooling in the 1870s and on that created the French. That these regional differences, disparities, breaches, that these existed until well into the 19th century. No doubt universal schooling, you know, smooths over differences. No doubt universal media through a country smooths over differences. I mean, no doubt that's an important factor in our own national history. When television, for example, began to be widespread in the 1950s, that, you know, all of a sudden everybody knows, you know, who Walter Cronkite was and so forth, Huntley and Brinkley, or, you know, entertainment programs. Then all of a sudden differences begin to be a factor. So but it's a big issue. It's a big issue. And part of the paradox of the French Revolution is that they're projecting things out into projecting speech out into a sounding board that only partially exists. There, to some extent, is no national audience for the national declarations that they make. What about gender? Or to be more specific, the situation of women? I mean, we've spoken about the way in which the assemblies and then the convention and then certainly the directory shut down any claim that women could make to vote or to sit in a representative assembly. I mean, in that sense, feminism awaited the future. How about in general? I mean, that's not the only way to gauge whether the French Revolution changed the situation of women or marked an advance in the situation of women. Yes?
I mean, and you have to look at it like, A, I'm not a woman. B, I'm not a woman in this time period.
All right,
But
so far.
I would be, I mean, I would be thrilled that I could divorce my abusive husband.
All right, okay.
And I mean, there were restrictions, you know, to an extent. But
Okay.
I mean, I guess in my mind, those advancements to me seemed more important than the right to vote at this time. But
Okay.
on the other edge of the sword, this is a time where everyone is talking about voting, everyone's talking about liberty. So that might not even be true because they
Okay.
can see their husbands, you know, getting involved through patriotism and stuff, and then they
Right.
think to themselves,
Municipal
why not?
government, district government
Yeah.
seems to be a men's affair. Yes?
I think that this kind of characterizes, well, I think the issues of gender and then the issues of like globalization and the colonies, like we talked about a couple
Mhm.
weeks ago. It kind of, it defines the limits of equality in the French Revolution.
Okay.
The bounds to which it was
Yeah.
able to spread.
Yeah. I mean, good point, good point. I want to come back to this idea that women may have pushed those bounds in addition to the way you indicated, Austin, in addition to the idea that for a good decade, they had gained rights of divorce that had not existed before. And that entailed also rights to dispose of some property in marriage that had not existed before. And that fell to the advantage of many women. But I do want to come back to it, but my word, Amy's point is well taken. That, before we fall into the trance of all this rhetoric of liberty, equality, fraternity, we need to think back on that reading about, the global revolution. Take, for example, who here read the piece on French Guinea in South Africa? Okay, right. I mean, out there, being a liberated slave and a French citizen meant what?
Not much, because it wasn't
Not
enforced.
much. Okay. Not much, no enforcement. I mean, formally slavery is lifted. Factually, the former slaves remain, for the most part, in the places where they were. And even slaves who came and wanted liberation on the basis that they had come from, let us say, Brazil, which was, of course, under Portuguese control, they end up in the same miserable situation. And when exactly did the vote take place that, by the 1795 Constitution, which enfranchised only the propertied male, the virtual slave is in no better situation than the real slave. So you piece this together into some notion of progress. That would be hard to do. That would be hard to do. And we start to appreciate that the French Revolution represented a series of advances, but it also represented a slew of limits. And pushing past those limits would take a good long time. France did not eliminate slavery, for example. That in law, it did not return to the principle of 1794 until 1848. And of course, then historians look at how little that meant, in fact, as opposed to in law. Okay, good point. Now back to the women, though. This whole question of the revision of gender relations as a result of the French Revolution. And here I go more by Tackett than by things that we read in McPhee. Although McPhee really has a nice section on this as well that maybe we should think about in a moment. Who attends these meetings of whether, I mean, Tackett deals more with Paris than with anywhere else, agreed? But there are meetings going all the time in these sections, in the clubs, in the assemblies. And what role do women play there? Who wrote on Rosalie Julien? No, I guess we didn't write on, I guess that's the one we went through in class discussion. I mean, what was she doing with regard to sectional, club, and assembly meetings? Well, I don't remember about all of them, but I remember about the assembly meetings. She was active. She was there. She was there. And there were women who took part. These, you know, when the women would you know, when the common people would parade through and demand action on this, that, or the other grievance that they had, they were female as well as male. So there comes an activation of women politically. We've spoke about this at the time. The women who marched out to Versailles took the royal family in hand and brought them back to Paris so that they could be under the supervision of the revolution. I mean, that looks to me like political activism. Political activism. And, you know, to give McPhee his due, you know, in some of this research at the village level, he did find out that there were local women's clubs and, you know, listed, you know, 22 members here and 57 members there. So the idea of a woman in politics, if in France the vote would come only after the Second World War, the idea of the woman in politics had begun to emerge. Let me ask you this. What you learn you ought to do with history is set yourself at some distance to it, right? I mean, in effect, the premise, the way in which history is often discussed and the way it is often taught, sets you at a divide from whatever the subject is. You deal with ancient Rome, but the idea is you're not an ancient Roman. And you're supposed to gain some advantage from that. You're supposed to gain the advantage of distance. You will see these events from a distance and therefore in a wider perspective than the participants. That's the idea of history. And no doubt some benefit comes from that premise. You don't get your knowledge of the past all snarled up with the kinds of passion that people have when they are participating in something in the present. And that's the rationale for history as I just described it. But at the same time, we have this idea that the past somehow hits us with a legacy. You know, that and in that way involves us, that there are, if we look, you know, if there's a kind of Grand Canyon that separates us from the French Revolution, there are bridges across it by which it touches us and by which we confront it, if that image works at all. Well, now you tell me. This subject, how does it touch you? Where are those points of contact? And you could say, well, wait a minute, we're Americans. What relationship are we supposed to have to a French Revolution? To which I would say, well, maybe 350 million people can offer that as an excuse, but not the 20 of us. You're taking a class in the subject. Yeah.
I mean, it just makes me thankful that our revolution was not nearly as chaotic.
No, it was not. Well, but one would be quick to counter, and I think Ryan brought up this point, that our revolution left slavery intact, which, you know, is a large part of its baggage. I mean, if the revolution here just seems like baggage, we weren't free of baggage either. In fact, I read something, in fact, you're going to read it too, come to think of it. But this is this book by Susan Buck Morse that's coming. And I think it's in there. If it's not in there, I apologize. I read too many things. But she had said, well, how should we deal with the fact that our forefathers, these people we revere, were slaveholders? Should we, no, I don't think it was in her. I think it was someplace else. Should we tear down, the Washington Monument? Should we tear down, pardon? Okay. She says, this is another author. He says, I think, just indicate that that is part of the legacy too. Just enlarge our awareness of Jefferson and of the good we think he did by the fact that he believed in the racial superiority of the white race and held slaves. In some way, make that part of his memorialization. Or Washington. Be true to history, in effect. Yes?
There's also the legacy because that was the culture at the time.
Mm-hmm.
For them it was normal. And times have changed now.
It was normal. Although people raised hue and cry about, I don't know anything about American history to speak of, but a few years ago I taught a course on autobiographies, and I thought, well, Benjamin Franklin wrote an autobiography, let's include that. And so I looked in, I read his autobiography for this class, but I also looked into it. He was an abolitionist at the end of his days. Benjamin Franklin was the only member of what? I guess of the constituent, the Constitutional Congress, that convention that had been in servitude because he was an indentured servant. So while, the idea that was common, but by no means inevitable. Yes?
But I think with regard to how it affects us, that there's a lot of ways you can't even see, but the ideals of the French Revolution had a huge impact. The Bolshevik Revolution has a lot of parallels to the French Revolution. The Spanish Revolution, things all the way up through World War I, there were monarchies, and most of them toppled at World War I in one way or another.
Yes.
And a lot of it finds its impetus in the idea that the French could do it.
Yeah.
The Bolsheviks, the Tsar didn't step down voluntarily.
No.
And neither did the king in Spain.
Yeah, the Bolsheviks, that's an example well taken, because I think the Bolsheviks, as much as any revolutionaries, thought in terms of France, 1789.
And even with regard to not so much the revolution itself, but the ideas that underpin the French Revolution that came out of the Enlightenment had a huge impact.
All right.
On the American Constitution and the way the founders thought.
Yeah.
And Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin loved France.
Yes, they did. And the cross currents, Tom Paine, for example, a Girondin, in the context of, your hand had been up, I think, Brian, at one point.
I was just saying, going back to the presentism, look back on slavery, look back, and it's good to look back and be impartial. Part of that is, you look back and say women didn't have the right to vote, but they were putting their voice out there. But that would have been a horrible concept for the man of the time. It wasn't that they were evil and we got to keep them down. So part of the historian's thing is, you want to look back at our time instead of theirs, but you also have to take their point of view of what was the concept at that time, not judge them by our standards.
I will tell you of one point that that's right. I certainly would agree with that as an historian. One of the things that I got from Tackett, I got a lot from Tackett that I'd never gotten before, in part because I left off teaching this subject for 15 years. So I'm confronting an entirely new generation of historian about this, of literature. One thing I got from him is there was a fair piece of support for the empowerment of women in France in the 1790s. It's just that it didn't have any immediate influence on the assemblies.
But I was reading Robespierre, just wait for him to get his. But I wasn't in his shoes at the time. Fear, paranoia, all that was going on at that time. got to the end of the book where he got beheaded, I'm like, yeah, about time you got yours too. But I wasn't in his shoes to know why he did what he did.
You know, the French say, "Tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner." To understand everything is to pardon everything. And I mean, historians can get into that frame of mind that Robespierre, well, what a villain, but you know, if you'd been in his situation, would you have done anything differently? But then often people would have. You know that. Yes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
But when you look at issues like the women's right issue in France or slavery here, there were a number of founders, maybe even in the North, a majority of them who were against slavery, but to keep the Union together and to make the whole thing work, they lived with it.
Yeah.
And that's a legacy that we regret now. But, you know, attitudes and pervasive ideologies like that, they don't turn over overnight.
That's right. But if I mean, Washington deserves his monument, but should his monument include some nod to this issue and to what you just said?
You can't escape it. No, it's just part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Now, I know myself, working as a contractor, I've been a member of the National Trust for Preservation, which is about structures, okay?
Yeah.
But preserving structures and preserving the idea, there's been cultural revolutions, as we see in Syria, ISIS destroying historically viable sites. We see in 1967 in Red China, we saw such valuable artifacts were destroyed.
Yeah.
Okay? And you see people today who want to destroy the stars and bars. It's the St. Andrew's cross. It's the same flag as Jamaica, which is black and red, but it's the same stars and bars as Scotland and the St. Andrew's cross. So any evil the stars and bars might have, okay, is in what it possessed in the past, not anything today.
Okay. Yeah.
I just think it's
Ryan.
important to note that the French Revolution, they tore down what they had and they built up on top of it. Well, if you talk about the American Revolution, these people were an ocean away. I mean, they already started this grand new task. It's not that daunting to think of that they had a revolution of governmental policy. I mean, the French had the English right next door and the Spanish. I mean, they had all these external pressures to have a monarchy, and they're trying to tear it all down and give everyone these freedoms. While the American Revolution, I mean, how many ever miles that is away from the rest of the world, really.
So you're saying that you think the American Revolution, in effect, had an easy go of it?
Yeah, I mean,
in comparison to the French.
Because I mean, they're on new land.
Yeah.
Completely, no one even knew what was west of where they were.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just completely new. So I don't think it's daunting to think of that they had a new government too. I mean, they went 2 weeks on a boat across to a land they didn't even know. So I mean, it's not surprising to me that they've built a new government too.
Okay, and this is an argument for why I think among revolutionaries the world over, no doubt the French Revolution has had drawn more interest than the American Revolution. Okay, yes.
I think that's why, in essence, the French Revolution failed in some aspects, is because they moved too quickly.
Under too many pressures, if I followed you from a moment ago.
Yeah, they had too many pressures from other parts of the world, and they moved too quickly, too fast. Almost like they took off sprinting and they ended up losing their balance and fell down. Because they gave too many freedoms too quickly. I think if we bring in the American Revolution, if they gave all the freedoms like slavery, they abolished it, I think they would have the same effect.
So if we return back to that 2016 French village that I fantasized about several minutes ago, what they celebrate is an awareness of things that took a long time to get sorted out.
Yeah.
Whereas an American could perhaps believe that as far as government went, and we're setting aside here the issue of slavery or the issue of Native Americans, but as far as government went, things were more secure to begin with.
Well, and I think it's because, I mean, it took 100 years for America to abolish slavery. It took a civil war that killed almost 2 million Americans.
Yeah.
But I think the French moved too fast to try to bring about this change, which caused so much instability.
So the French are a cautionary tale.
Yes.
Which makes you wonder why the people who have admired them the most are the impatient ones. Your hand, I think, had been up, Cameron.
Oh,
No?
I didn't have.
No, there you see. See, at my age, I mean, yeah, okay.
I was just going to respond to that. Instead of, I don't know if temporally, like if it moved too fast per se, but I do think that they took on so much more than the Americans did. They really did have to do a roots up revolution. I mean,
Yeah.
they transformed so much more of their daily life of on every level, by getting rid of their monarchy and then trying to institute even a new calendar, and standardizing French. I mean, there was just so many different things that they were undertaking at the same time.
That's true. Let me ask you this. This idea that, yes, all that went wrong, but the French had no option. I mean, does that appeal to you? That if we represent actors in history under the pressures that we can identify, we, in effect, get to the point where we cannot imagine that they would have acted differently. Does that make sense to you? Or to resume this conversation here from a moment ago with Dune, can someone say, yes, but Benjamin Franklin lived at the same age and he thought ... I mean, that's an issue that we're going to enlarge upon massively when we get to the book by Susan Buck Morse. What was it capable, what was capable to be thought? Let me give you an example that she gives. I love this example. The revolution in Haiti, all right? Slave rebellion. And to make a long story short, the slaves prevail. Napoleon sends a general by the name of Leclerc in 1802 to try to regain the territory and reimpose slavery. The slave revolution prevails. And there were among Napoleon's troops, Leclerc's troops, a contingent of Poles from Poland who were told at some point when rebels had been captured, drown them. I think probably put them on it. That would have been the way they would have done it. Put them on a ship and sink the ship. That was a means of execution. And they refused. So the idea that history is closed, that circumstances close people down. There were also some French troops who were on record as having said, when they were lining up in battle against the slaves and heard the slaves singing the Marseillaise, which is the French anthem, La Marseillaise, who thought and said, we're on the wrong side. Now, so all the weight of racism, all the weight of nationalism, all the weight of ideas of superiority and inferiority, none of those ideas lose their force, except I just pointed to two instances where they were somehow suspended. And that interests me as well. And I don't mean to paint Robespierre as a fool, but I'm not satisfied by the idea that all of those pressures that he was under makes him just a desperate man taking desperate steps in desperate times. That the idea was thinkable in 1793, stop. And he did not stop. So when I think of history, I mean, people can counterfactual themselves into oblivion, but I don't think of history as in effect answering why it is that people were in the trap they were in, because I do question whether they're always in traps. Yeah.
Well, we don't know, especially with individual personalities like a Robespierre.
Yeah.
Maybe he was mentally ill at some level.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't know that.
Well, he had an extraordinary inability to sort of brush off the criticisms from Brissot. I mean, he just didn't have that in him.
Right.
Yeah, good question.
So, to say that he couldn't stop, maybe it just wasn't part of his biological, physiological makeup. Maybe he was nuts.
Maybe he was nuts.
The responsibility he took upon himself was so massive. I'm going to run the country.
Yeah.
He felt himself as such a martyr to the revolution. I can't imagine how he got through the stress of a couple of days. It would obviously drive you to the point where you
Yeah.
had to be rabid against your enemy to make you be successful in that position. That's Stalin.
There's a lot of those guys in history where there's no way they were balanced and sane, or they wouldn't have done the things they did.
But I wonder how much explanatory value that has, or if that isn't just almost a kind of tautology. To do what Robespierre did, he had to be crazy. To do what Stalin did, he had to be crazy. To do what Hitler did, he had to be crazy. And in the end, I don't know. It seems it's emotionally satisfying to say things like that, but I wonder in the end if you've said anything.
You can't possibly imagine the amount of pressure those guys were under, so you can't possibly imagine the mental state they were in unless you're actually in it.
But also, like, you have to imagine, like, he was for getting rid of a king. And, like, at this time, that is relatively unheard of, you know, just getting rid of him. And, like, so that high that you get off of that, like, the country is just on this little high of, like, oh, we kind of did this.
The decision to execute the king was carried by, what, 2 votes, 3 votes? I can't remember. Just a handful, or 1 vote, just a very, very small margin. So this craziness that we pin on Robespierre, do we mean to pin it also on every member of the convention that voted in favor of the execution of the king? At which point it becomes collective, not individual. And do we mean to say that some kind of collective mental state drives people to act the way they do? Which makes the question whether Robespierre himself was imbalanced less relevant. Or in the end, have a group of men, in this case, come together and made a decision from which they could have distanced themselves. Victor.
They had a blueprint for regicide from the English, which was pretty important. It's not mentioned a lot, but I believe at the time they relied a lot on the killing of Charles I and saying that brief republic, brief English republic, which influenced not only the United States but had a tremendous influence on their blueprint.
But you know, change 1 vote or 2 votes or however many it was, and all of a sudden the argument becomes much different. Despite the influence of what you're talking about, the regicide of Charles I, despite this, a majority of the convention decided on mercy along with the Girondins when the crucial vote came in January of 1793. My argument becomes an argument in favor of contingency, in favor of open possibilities in history, and not of closed ones. Yes?
I was just going to say, it's interesting that you bring up that point, because I actually agree with you that it's not, to say somebody's insane or is mentally ill is almost dismissive of their actions. And to understand that, like, the French Revolution and the leaders of the French Revolution, you know, the leaders of the French Revolution, they were characterized by this extreme rationalism. Like, they really felt like they were rationally making decisions towards the, you know, setup of a constitutional monarchy, towards the regicide. I mean, they felt like, hey, we're going to take this to a vote. We're going to. They're trying to do things in the best way they can, and I don't think history is inevitable. That there always are different branches that somebody somehow could have made.
It's bending it back into Germany. But
I hate to see that.
A year or 2 ago, I read a biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
All right.
And that was a great insight into how the German people wound up going along with Hitler. Because they were caught between competing influences. The austerity of the way the rest of Europe dealt with Germany left many of the people who would have been opposed to Hitler afraid to act because they figured they're just going to come down on us harder.
You're referring to the Versailles Treaty, or?
No. The people who, there were opportunities for Hitler to be taken out.
Okay.
Throughout the course of his ascendancy.
Oh, okay.
And people could see what was coming, but they were afraid to act because they thought, you know what, that when the French and the British find out what's going on, they're going to think Germany's even worse, and they're just going to double down on us. And when I look at something like the French Revolution, there's a momentum, a collective momentum, but there are definitely a handful of people who drive it. I mean, if Robespierre hadn't have been making his firebrand speeches in the National Assembly, would they have voted to execute the king?
Robespierre and others. I mean, in such a tight, I mean, it's hard for me to say. You know, Robespierre was a leader of such magnetism that I can't imagine that vote with a magnitude of 200, whatever it was, 260 some odd. I can't imagine that number diminished by 1 or 2 or 3. I can. And then we've got an entirely different situation, and the impetus to think of Robespierre in those terms. Let me ask you a question about your biography. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a Protestant theologian. I think most people encounter something about him at some point, sometimes in church, if not in school, and that is that he joined a resistance movement against Hitler and was prepared to the idea of violence against Hitler. He was put in prison before the actual conspiracy to commit that violence led to the famous assassination attempt, 20th of July, 1944, and was executed then thereafter, although he was there in spirit, but not in, that is in the attempt, not in fact. Now, my question to you, Joe, is the German people under these pressures that you list, but Bonhoeffer's then the sterling exception, because he does favor resistance and he does favor opposition, and he is part of that movement. I mean, we can pile up reasons to indicate why there was no strong resistance or no determined resistance against Hitler, but then at some point we have to turn in the other direction and ask, so why was there this determined resistance against Hitler, even if the reasons seem like an adequate explanation why there could not be? My question to you, how does Bonhoeffer then come off in this biography of him?
Well, he's one of the few, at least in Metaxas's book, who was always there and ready to act.
All right.
But there were a lot of people who had opportunities, and when that crucial moment came, they wavered because they were just afraid.
All right.
And I can look at the National Assembly in France. I would bet there were a ton of people in the Jacobins who even voted with Robespierre, but they were going through it saying, this is wrong and I'm caught.
All right. Yeah, no doubt. But just change the votes of 2 of them and I see history going a different way. And I wonder which 2 and why. Yeah.
Don't you think, like, if they voted against executing the king, they'd just voted on it 6 months later or something, and he would have been dead? Because if you vote to execute the king, you're not changing your vote. But if you vote not to execute the king, I could see you changing to the other side eventually.
Conceivably.
I mean, so I don't know if it'll just be
Conceivably.
inevitable.
But let's say the Girondins, you know, gain momentum out of that, and all of a sudden they're the ones in control. And they've staked everything on republic, but no regicide.
But who's to say that they wouldn't act just like the mountain once they gained a lot of control?
Not me, because I don't know how they would act.
Yeah.
And I see, I think for me, history is studying both these large factors that weigh on people and noticing the possibility of decision and contingency at the same time. You know, I'm going to teach a course over spring break called Nazis and Jews in European Film, and I'm thinking about a particular film right now. It's a film, I mean, it's a feature film. It's based on a story true to life, but I think this part of the film is just a film. It's fictional. The film is called The Counterfeiters. And the idea of the film is there were a group of Jews who had the necessary specialties, that is, the specialties the Nazis needed for a massive counterfeiting operation. to produce false British pounds and false American dollars, with the idea to flood each economy, the two enemy economies, with false currency, in this way to destabilize the economies and win the war. And that, in fact, existed at the concentration camp at Sachsenhausen, which is not too far from Berlin. And the character that I'm thinking about, there then develops among these 30 or 40 inmates who are given privileged, better food, better conditions in every way, though they remain prisoners, and they have to produce, there's a forger, there's someone who runs, printing presses and so forth. They've got all of these specialists who are doing this, performing this task for the Nazis, particularly among there's kind of a main two that become the center of this. And one of them says, for goodness sake, produce what they want, just drag it out a little bit. We live another day, it's another day. It's a good in and of itself, let it go. And the other says, this is a real possibility to sabotage this regime. They get nothing for us, nothing from us. And the two of them are then in this kind of, war of the titans. This is completely fictional, but it's quite impressive in the film. And I'm thinking of the character named Burger, who's the one who is so adamant about use the freedom we have to resist. And it goes back and forth, but it's a magnificent film. And but the film draws out that heroism is an unsteady thing, that he vacillates sometimes. There are times when he seems remarkably daring and almost confrontational with the Nazis who are above him, but there are times when he just backs away, because in the end, he, in that moment he loves life more than his principle, and there are other moments when he loves his principle more than his life, and you get a wonderful representation that, how tenuous freedom is. Well, that's the kind of freedom that I'm talking about when I think about the French revolutionaries in 1793. I think of people who could rouse themselves to do this and don't, or who do rouse themselves to do it, but and turn their back on comfort, ease. Yes?
In line with the vacillation and those kinds of things, and I have to speak to Bonhoeffer because we don't see it revealed here.
No.
But Bonhoeffer knew that if he was found out, his sisters, his parents,
there's a lot of risk.
Everybody he knew was going to be arrested, thrown in jail, tortured, whatever. And those are pressures on individuals that we don't. I mean, I have to believe Robespierre made a few of those kind of threats to people.
Mm-hmm.
You stay with me and vote on this thing, or we're going to come visit somebody.
Oh, I don't doubt. But I wonder how many voted for the Girondins who had received that very threat. I mean, I see these people as, when I turn on my mobile phone, once in a while, all the icons, usually all the icons are quite stable, but once in a while they're shaking a little bit. And I have to press the main button in order to stabilize them. I don't know why. Maybe I should go to Verizon and complain. But in any case, and that's kind of the way that might be a metaphor for the way I see people. I see people in their distinct positions, but sometimes subject to vacillation. And it's that moment of vacillation that I think has to interest the historian as much as the moments of stability. People just do crazy things, and sometimes they do it for principle, like those Poles. There was no gain in the Poles to say, we won't sink those rebels. We won't do that. There was no gain for them in that. No. It was insubordination. But they did it. And if they had let them sink, then I'd be the first to say, why? Well, because of military discipline, because in an army you're under the pressure, you have to do this, you have to do that. But they didn't, so I'd be explaining the wrong thing. So it fascinates me, and in the end, this is not, I think, a sublime, profound point, and that is, There's some give in all of these structures. There's some give in all of these structures.
But that's just human fallibility.
Yeah.
None of us is so certain and fixed in our principle that we think we are.
Yeah, okay.
You get up and you have a bowl of Cheerios with a bad Cheerio in it, and all of a sudden you think something different.
Yeah. Okay, so, let the factor of, the human heart sway in the little ways that it is capable of swaying too. And bear in mind the Cheerio, and you should be awarded an honorary doctorate in history. Anyway, let's call it a day. I've got my work cut out for me, goodness. All these papers to grade. You think I look forward to that?
We'll see you next year.
Yeah, there you go.
I know you said that you're loosely, like, going up to
My grandchildren are coming this weekend too.
April. It's just completely.
I think I'm going to let them grade your papers. 4 and 2.
I'm sure they know what an A is.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, we'll see.
But it is, it's the things that we don't know.
Yeah,
All the influences and things that happen.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. Take care. Bye-bye now. Yeah. Yeah, have a good day too, Brian. Bye-bye now. Yeah, take care.
Too much.
Tuesday, 1 to 3:30. Like when? Afternoon is hard. Morning?
50 pages of your.
Are you at that job in the library? Yeah. And I never got a call about that.
Oh, you didn't?
No, I did check on my other phone where I suspected I had missed a message and there was no message. So they just took you on your own steam. They didn't. Yeah. So, then I don't know. Email me, okay, about when, maybe about what you want to talk about, but at least when you can. Oh, Friday's really tough for me because these kids are coming, and I've got things I've got to get done here. Anyway, email me about some possibilities, okay? Okay, take care now.
Which is good, you know what I mean?
Thank you, the 3 Ds. All right. Hi.
Cameron was supposed to be my referee, I believe.
Yeah.
But I think she forgot, or not forgot, she thought that she was a referee for somebody else.
Oh.
So I wasn't able to get, so I just left a note there that.
Okay. You're right, Cameron was your referee.
So I think she said a guy named Brian or something like that. She thought she refereed for somebody.
No, Brian was her referee.
So I don't know if she got that mixed up. So yeah, I just left that.
Have you been in touch with Cameron about this?
Yeah.
Okay.
I emailed her, but she wasn't able to email me back or anything like that. So I just saw her before class, and then she told me that that's why, because she thought she was refereeing for, I think, Brian or something like that. That she was probably gonna review his essay instead. So.
Well, wait a second. Cameron was your referee, right?
Yes.
Brian was Cameron's referee.
Yeah.
Okay, so she got that relationship mixed up. Is Cameron willing to serve as your referee now? I mean, she just left, so I don't know.
I could email her and maybe
Yeah.
get back to you.
Yeah, if you would do that, please, Edmund. I'd appreciate that. Because I do like the assignment and not just to forget about it, because I think it is constructive what a referee can do.
Yeah. So yeah, I could.
Okay, all right. See what she says. Okay, thanks very much. Take care.
I apologize if I get to be a problem.
No, you're no problem. It's too interesting, isn't
The
it?
question, it is. The question with Washington, though, I mean, it's so hard for me personally to judge people out of the context of their place and time.
Yeah.
Their position. I mean, do we all, well, hopefully, do we all wish that slavery had been abolished and everything? Well, yeah. I mean, there were political pressures and considerations that we don't even know about.
Okay. Yeah, well, all of those fit in. I mean, I remember one time I had a teaching assistant, and the classes all had to do with the British Empire in, I think, India, if I remember. And the teaching assistant said, well, no, the British troops showed no sympathy to the Indians because that was simply not part of the time in which they lived.
Right.
And I thought, what? I mean, there was plenty of sympathy. There was, I mean, by then, I mean, for example, Quakers, famous, took on this whole issue of slavery and subjugation from a moral, religious standpoint. In Britain, I mean, I'm thinking just of Britain now, but it would have been the Unitarians, for example, who just, who just set their face against slavery. I don't mean to idealize them, but on that point there was just no bending.
Right.
And to make people aware that too is all part of this history. That Washington's position, I mean, Washington may have been ambivalent about his position, but it was contested.
Right. And, relative to the Native Americans, the idea that there was an ideology which maybe Custer represents, that, we're just going to kill them and take the gold.
Yeah.
I mean, that's wrong, and we know that.
And I've done it before, but I start like just